Hello, everybody. I hope everybody's having a good week. So we're halfway there. So we're now discovering chapter 6 this week, chapter 7, and chapter 8. And this is the first 3 years. Okay, so as we already know by going throughout the course, each module is going to have a physical component, a cognitive component, and also a socio-emotional component. Okay, so for this mini lecture, I'm going to focus on chapter 6 and a topic that I think is important. Some people may find it important, yes, but sometimes people find it difficult to get interested in it. Sometimes the physical chapters can be a little dry and kind of hard to understand, or just maybe not interesting to many other people. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so you probably remember this from the last module. We touched on this in the prenatal development chapter. The cephalocadal principal growth pattern and also the proximal-distal pattern of growth. So if you guys remember, the cephalocadal has to do with from growth starting from the head downwards versus the proximal-distal pattern is going from inwards to outwards. So we discussed that in the last section where cephalocadal growth, you see that a lot in prenatal development because one of the first things to develop is the brain and spinal cord, and that's falling at cephalocadal growth and development. And you can really see that here, in the fetal stage in around 2 months, you can see the head is very much enlarged. It's disproportionate to the rest of the body. And then even in fetal stage at 5 months, even then, we do have the head being, at a larger size. As we continue, a newborn also has time to grow. Their brain has time to develop, and also their physical growth, elongating, growing taller, having their extremities go taller. So you're going to see both the cephalocadal and the proximal-distal pattern. So as you guys can see, as we, age throughout the early years, we have 2 years, 6 years, 12, and into our 20s, we start to see more of the proximal-distal pattern taking over. So we start to lengthen more, okay? But overall, as I said, cephalocadal is one of the first growth patterns, and then proximal-distal kind of takes over from there. Okay. Okay. So the topic that I want to focus on for this one is more brain development. Like I said, some of the topics in the physical component chapters can be a little dry, so I'll spend a little bit of time on those because I know they can be a little bit difficult to kind of understand or even to get motivated to try to get into. And honestly, for myself, I really do like talking about brain development, so I really enjoy, and hopefully you find it enjoyable as well. So with brain, and in the first 3 years, there's a lot of components that are very essential that you need to kind of observe. If you have your own child or you work with children within the first 3 years. So we do have to see central nervous system growth. Okay, so how do we know the central nervous system is functioning properly? How do we know that there is no delays? Well, typically we're going to see that through the observations. Okay, so the central nervous system is one of the most important components when it comes to how we engage in any behavior, especially as we're infants, as we go in through, our toddler years into early childhood. So that brain and spinal cord that continues to become more developed, that sends sensory messages to the brain. So anytime, let's say you have an infant and you show them a new toy and they get very excited and they stare at it for a very long time, well, those are sensory messages that are being sent to their brain. Sensory messages don't only have to be visual, but they could be any of the other senses as well. So taste, touch, smell, etc. So, for example, you may have seen that when something is new, an infant typically would be very interested in it. They spend a lot of time focusing on it. So you may have seen, for example, infants like to hear the same song over and over and over again, and even in early childhood, you may hear them play the same song or that same movie over and over and over and over again. Well, that's because their sensory signals are being traveled to the brain and they find some interest in it. We do see that over time, yes, they become used to that. So they may get tired of that particular thing and move on to something else. The other thing about the central nervous system that's important is it also not only sends those sensory messages to our brain, but certain messages that are being sent sensory wise are going to facilitate motor behavior. Okay, so for example, we'll talk a little bit about this in the next couple of slides, but there's a theory that you maybe remember from the theories chapter a couple of chapters ago, and there was a theory called Piaget's theory of cognitive development. And that one is also coinciding very well with motor development as well. So, for example, one of the things that he said is that children go through stages and there's different things that they're experiencing within their environment. So, for example, children are learning the cause and effect of how they are impacted by their environment. So, motor commands travel throughout the brain. So, those sensory messages that we're receiving, either if it's sound, it's touch, it's visual, we may engage in a motor behavior to facilitate or to encourage that specific behavior. So, a good example of what I'm talking about is if you ever observed an infant, um, they may start to bang like a set of keys, right? And they keep banging it, banging it, banging it. Or maybe you're feeding an infant and they keep throwing the spoon, down on the floor. And, parents may find that irritating, but that's actually showing their central nervous system. They're receiving sensory messages. So one of the sensory messages is when they drop that item or when they bang that item, there's a sound that goes along with that. So when they hear that sound, it also facilitates motor coordination, motor feedback, where they're continuously engaging in that motor behavior. And eventually, they may become masters of whatever behavior that may be. Okay, so here are just some structures that are important to talk about. So this is very basic introduction into brain anatomy, brain development, especially in infancy. So, like I said before, when it comes to that cephalocaudal principle of growth, we have that brain and spinal cord that are being matured first in prenatal development. Well, we also see that more so as well in the first month of life. Okay, so you can see that the forebrain is quite larger than other parts of the brain, the midbrain or the hindbrain. And you can also see that here, forebrain is a little bit larger. You have your hindbrains, spinal cord, and then obviously as we continue to develop, the forebrain becomes more matured. Okay, and in general, the hindbrain and the midbrain are smaller than the forebrain, but you can see that if the forebrain becomes more developed quicker than more of the other areas of the brain. So what is the forebrain? So the forebrain pretty much covers your prefrontal cortex, and basically the forebrain is going to be responsible for a number of things, but anything related to thinking, perceiving, so like I said, perception, sensory information, and basically evaluating what that sensory information is. In a way, you can kind of think of it as the filter to understanding our environment. So once that forebrain receives all that information from our environment, either it's sensory, either it's motor, then the forebrain can send it off to other brain structures. So in a way, it's kind of like a filter. And then we have the midbrain right here. So mid, you can think of it as middle. So it's between the forebrain and the hindbrain. And that particular structure is associated with motor functions particularly, and also auditory and visual responses. So I said before, the forebrain receives all the incoming information. So let's say when a baby is watching, a Sesame Street, right? They may be looking at the colors, listening to all the sounds, all the songs. So the forebrain perceives all that information, but then carries it over to other structures, such as the midbrain, which more specializes in understanding what that information is, like auditory, visual responses. Then we have the hindbrain, which is right over here. So this one has to do with more autonomic processes, so any functions that are related to our survival, so breathing, our heart rate, our sleep rate, any survival function, okay? And obviously hindbrain means, behind, so it's towards the back of our neck over here. So this is just how the brain development goes within the first month. You can see, as I said, the frontal lobe becomes or the forebrain, I'm sorry, the forebrain becomes much more differentiated. Another thing that you can see when it comes to the brain is that you can see that there's not a lot of curvatures, there's not a lot of differentiation between many structures, right? So as you can see, 3 months, you still don't, you can kind of see the difference right here, the forebrain, and then maybe the middle brain here, and then the hindbrain. You can see that. But it really doesn't become very differentiated until the 6 months. So you can see like these little crevices here. That basically means that things are becoming more specialized. And that happens a lot through experience, okay, and also neuroplasticity. So overall, the brain plasticity in infancy is very, very high. So basically meaning that the brain is highly plastic. So basically, whenever anything's experienced, the infants continue learning and taking in that information and then consolidating that. Okay. Another good thing about this brain plasticity, where the brain's more moldable and plastic, is that if any injury does occur in the infant stages, not that we want anything to happen, but because we have such high brain plasticity in infancy, children typically can come back from a brain injury or something that happened within their brain. Okay, so you can see in this last one, 9 months. So the cerebrum is basically the full area of the brain where we can measure it into left and right hemispheres. So you may have heard of that before. You have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and each has their different functions. And depending on what we get to, I may talk about the left and right, but we'll go ahead and talk about the rest of these structures here. So the cerebellum is also a very important part when it comes to infancy. So the cerebellum is very specific to balance, coordination, and motor movement. Okay, and when you think about that, you may be thinking, okay, why is that important? Well, one of the major, I guess you could say, milestones in infancy is the ability to begin to stand, to kind of bear your weight, okay, also crawl, and walking, right? These sound very simple, but the cerebellum actually is helping out in those motor behaviors. So at 9 months, you guys can see that it's a lot more specialized by how many curvatures, how many connections it does have, versus in the other months, you really don't see that. You don't really see the cerebellum as specialized. So typically around 9 months, you're going to have an infant who has been crawling maybe for about 2-3 months, and usually from about the 11-month range to 18 months, you'll start to see more walking behaviors. I mean, obviously, every child's different, but typically what they say is that a child should start walking around the age of a year old. And that cerebellum has to do with those, motor behaviors, because you need a lot of balance and coordination and ability to engage in motor tasks, to put one foot in front of the other and balance at the same time. So the cerebellum is very much focalized in that milestone. And then we have the brainstem. So the brainstem has to do with the hindbrain. So we talked about these right here. So the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, they're just very basic areas that are in brain development. But as you continue to go throughout infancy and into early childhood, then it becomes more specialized, like I said. So the forebrain has specific structures as it becomes more mature, and also the midbrain does, and the hindbrain does as well. So within the hindbrain is the brainstem. Okay, so basically the brainstem is they call it our reptilian brain. Basically, it's our most oldest functional part of ourselves. And this is the one that basically controls all the survival functions, like I said before. So your brainstem is going to control your ability for your heart rate to continue, your breathing rate, how your body regulates hormones as well, how your body regulates sleep, because without sleep, we're not able to function properly. Anything that requires any survival function. Thirst as well as part of that, hunger, and there's also other structures that help with that, but the brainstem is the major component when it comes to that. So one thing about the brainstem that people don't know about is that if there is any damage to the brainstem, it's very likely that you'll become, how can I say this, unable to respond. So you either will be dead if you have any injuries to your brainstem, because that pretty much regulates all survival functions, or you'll be in a coma, or you may have some type of severe brain damage where you're not consciously there. Okay. All right, so here's the next component that we'll be talking about. So we've already really discussed the spinal cord and brainstem, so you guys know what that is. Cerebellum we just talked about. So I did say I was going to talk about the cerebrum. So I did say that the cerebrum covers both of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. And as we continue throughout infancy, you're going to see lateralization that occurs. So basically, as you continue to gain experience through learning in your environment when you're an infant and into early childhood, you're going to see more specialization of the hemispheres. So typically, the left hemisphere is going to have its own functions, and the right hemisphere is going to have its own functions. So, for example, when we look at brain research and cognitive neuroscience, we do see a lot of research that points to the left hemisphere being very language-based, logic-based as well, the science being able to use hypothetical reasoning, also math, being able to do arithmetic, division, any type of numerical ability, and as I said, language as well. On the other hand, we have the right hemisphere, and as we see through cognitive neuroscience, that it also has a specialization of what that specific hemisphere does as well. So the right hemisphere has more of focalized attention when it comes to emotions. So the ability for someone to be able to process emotions, so either someone else's emotions or their own. We also see that the right hemisphere has been associated with more creativity. We also see the right hemisphere associated with facial recognition, face perception. So the ability to understand, you're looking at a person, and that kind of goes hand in hand with emotions as well, right? So whenever you're looking at someone, you're also trying to process, maybe how they're feeling, if they're angry or whatever it may be. The right hemisphere has a lot to do with, like I said, creativity, but we also see artistic behaviors. So a lot of abstract thinking requires some type of creative thought. For example, whenever you're trying to think of, let's say you have to write a paper for your English class, right? And let's say this is a position paper where you have to kind of make an argument, right? So of course you're going to use logic in that, right? So your left hemisphere is going to be using all that logic base, but the ability for you to come up with an argument does require some type of abstract thought, right? How am I going to make this argument where people are going to be able to be persuaded, right? So abstract thought has a lot more to do with the right hemisphere. Let's see. Oh, corpus callosum or callosum, depends on how you want to say it. So the corpus callosum is very much related to the cerebrum, the left and right hemispheres. So between the left and right hemisphere it's basically a tissue of fibers, okay? And it's a structure, and it's between the left and right hemisphere. But basically what the major focus is for this structure is that it sends information from the left to the right hemisphere, okay? So for example, if you guys ever taken an intro-psych class, or maybe you just done your own research with brain development, is anytime that you close your eye, let's say you put your hand over your right eye, and you're only seeing things with your left eye, well, that visual information is being processed and being taken throughout the frontal lobe, and then it goes through many different structures, but basically the left is receiving that information, the left visual field. But it actually doesn't get processed in the left hemisphere. It actually gets processed in the opposite hemisphere, so the right hemisphere. So same thing, whenever you're looking at something with your right visual field, it's going to be processed in your opposite to that, so the left hemisphere, okay? And basically it's very interesting that we see that, but the corpus callosum basically designates, how those communications go from left versus to right. Okay, So, talked about the corpus callosum. So, I'll give you guys an example just to understand this a little bit more, and then also I'll post a video as well about it. So, there's a video out there, and I want to say it's called Split Brain John. And I'll post it with this video so you guys can take a look at it. It's very short, it's about 10 minutes long at the most. So, this really is a great case study of cognitive neuroscience and to understanding what the actual function of certain structures are. So one of the major brain structures that's focused on in that video is the corpus callosum. So Split Brain John is the person that these researchers are investigating, and he's a very unique case because he has suffered many seizures throughout all his life, and it got to the point where no medication was working, and they wanted to try other methods. So one of the methods that was suggested to this patient who had many seizures was to sever the corpus callosum. So to take out a portion of the corpus callosum, because what they noticed is that a lot of the seizure activity was occurring in that area. So it was kind of experimental. You could say that they wanted to see, well, what happens if we take a little bit of that area out? Does it lower that activity of seizure activity? So interestingly, for this specific case, it did work. So he ended up having decreased seizure attacks. But you're also wondering, okay, well, they took out a piece of his brain. So how does that affect his functioning? So a lot of individuals were very skeptical, or even like doctors, researchers, like, well, what's going to happen to a person when you do that to them? Well, he actually was very functional. So he was still able to talk, he was still able to hold a conversation, he was still able to walk, whatever it may be, but he did process information differently. So basically, when they did that severing of the corpus callosum, is they basically created two brains now. Instead of having one brain, now this person had two brains. So as I said before, whenever we're seeing something, like either in our left or our right, well, it's taking both hemispheres to process that information, right? So for example, if I see something in my left, it's going to go to my right hemisphere. If I see something in my right visual field, it's going to go to my left hemisphere. So with this specific patient named John, since it was severed, now he had two brains working independently. So sometimes when he was being asked questions, and there was a study, and you'll see that if you watch the video, whenever he, for example, was shown something to his right visual field, right? So if you cover your left eye and only your right eye sees it, well, it's going to be processed by your left hemisphere. So your left hemisphere, as I said, is important in processing language. So let's say he saw the word frog. Well, he was able to say, oh, I see the word frog. But interestingly, when you have the opposite field, so the left visual field being shown the word frog, he actually really doesn't see it. So he's not able to verbalize and say, oh, I see the word frog. And he's sometimes very confused, but if you ask him, like, well, what do you think the word is? His brain is still aware of the information, it's just not being processed as efficiently as someone who doesn't have that separation. So with him, for example, if you ask him to draw it, he'll be able to draw a picture of a frog. So it's really interesting. I think you guys should check out that video. Okay. Okay. So now we talked about brain development a little bit. So now we're going to talk a little bit just about some motor development milestones. So as I said, brain development is important to talk about because without the maturing and learning of the brain, then it's going to be very difficult to, achieve these milestones. And one of those is motor development. So if you remember back to what we're talking about brain structures, which one is very much focalized on balance, coordination, and motor behavior? Do you guys remember? I hope you do. And that's the cerebellum, if you guys didn't remember that. So that has to do with motor development. So these are just some milestones. So head control, typically around 4 months. We see that babies are now able to kind of balance their head. They don't need a lot of support as much within the first 3 months. Hand control. So hand control, they can pick up tiny objects around 7 to 11 months. And with this, what's very important to talk about with motor development are the fine motor and gross motor skills. Okay, so if you guys remember from your readings, fine motor skills require the specialization of smaller muscles being able to engage in complex tasks, right? So when you think about fine, think of small. So any of our small muscles that we have, requires some ability for us to engage in motor activity, right? So the hands would be one of those. Our, bones and muscles in our feet are typically more related to the fine motor skills versus our legs, our arms are more related to gross motor skills. So those are larger muscles, right? So when it comes to hand control, that's fine motor skill, right? So as someone who works in early childhood, which many of you may do so, especially at the younger ages, you want to develop these fine motor and gross motor skills. So picking up a tiny object is very important because that leads to other things. So picking up tiny objects, putting them into smaller holes. So you may have seen those toys where you have a bunch of different shapes and you try to fit them in the holes. Well, that's a fine motor task right there. So the ability for that child to twist and turn that specific object into a, very specialized or very small space is important. Then obviously those fine motor skills will continue to develop, and then eventually they may, use a crayon, they may start to color, and then obviously when they go to grade school, start to write, and those fine motor skills are being developed. So those are just why they're important. So we need to have hand control early on, 7 to 11 months. And then let's see, locomotion as well. So being able to get around on their own, so either by, creeping or crawling. And then obviously locomotion is important because crawling is kind of that first building block when it comes to all gross motor skills, using the legs and the bigger muscles of the body, right? So typically if a child crawls, they're probably going to start walking soon, right? And then once we start walking, then we go into more specialized motor tasks. So, jogging, running, jumping up and down, standing on one foot. Those are all more specialized gross motor skills. And then we have social referencing. So social referencing is also important when it comes to motor development. So learning how to perceive a situation. So looking if something is not comfortable for them, something's different. And usually when it's different for them, it could be either they feel frightened, they feel anxious. So social referencing is very important when it comes to motor development because they're using their visual system to understand what's going on around them. And then also if they do perceive something frightening, they may avoid that, right? So a good example of social referencing is that maybe you have seen maybe an infant or a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, when mom leaves the room, they start to get very anxious or they cry immediately, right? Well, that's social reference. They're looking, it's like, oh, wait, this is not what I'm used to. Where's my mom? Where's my dad, right? And they could perceive it as frightening because they're not familiar with that environment. Okay, so this will be the last slide that we cover for physical development for this little PowerPoint. So another important thing when it comes to motor development and perception is being able to understand the world around you. Okay, so yes, the visual is very important to understand facial cues, to understand, if a situation is threatening or safe. But then also, whenever a child's exploring their environment, you also have to have other perception skills, I guess you could say. So depth perception and haptic perception. So one study that I like to talk about that was really interesting was a study done by psychologists, and they called it the visual cliff scenario. So this is what this picture is right here. So basically what these researchers were interested in is to see if children were aware, even though a situation was, dangerous, would they still be able to perceive it as dangerous? So basically what they created here is just like a little platform. Okay, so the baby starts out in this little area right here. So you can see it's marked by red and white what is it, check marks? No. Checkerboard? Couldn't think of the word for that. Checkerboard, right? And then you have a child that is typically crawling because they were interested to see, well, when you're crawling, you have different perception of the world around you versus walking, right? So what they wanted to see is that even though they started out right here, you wouldn't be able to tell from over here until you got closer that there's nothing there, right? And I will tell you that there is something there, so it's plexiglass, and it continues to go. So the baby's just not going to drop off. But that's kind of the reason they call it the visual cliff, because from a certain standpoint, it drops off that this little area here. So they were interested to see that if babies are able to perceive depth perception, so to see the surface of three-dimensional, to understand that when things get closer, things become more detailed, or when you get closer to something, you start to understand like, oh, there's many different levels of that, which is depth perception. Interestingly, what they found is that babies that were crawling at 6 months, they didn't really have much depth perception. So what they would do is they would have mom right over here saying, "Come here, come here," so come here, Heather, whatever the child's name was, and the 6-month-old baby would just walk right across, didn't even flinch, and walk right across to mom. And that's showing that they don't have any depth perception. But then around 10 months, what they found in this study is that once they hit that 10-month range, is that they didn't go all the way to mom and just, didn't even flinch. They actually would stop like around here and be hesitant. And some of them wouldn't even go across. So it's like they can see that there's something going on here where it does drop off and it's a dangerous situation or it's frightening, which is very interesting. So I like that example. I think that's really fun. And then lastly, haptic perception is important. So this is very important when it comes to motor development, and the fact that you'll see a lot of children will manipulate objects around them. So they may, use objects in different ways. They may break things because they're trying to acquire what more information they can about it, how to handle them. Okay, so you may see a child use like a spoon as a telephone, right? So in a way, that's not necessarily right, but if you put it up to your ear, then you're acquiring the information that when you put something up to the ear, then that means that you're talking to someone, right? Or sometimes children will play with Play-Doh and manipulate that and make little, balls, or they'll just continue to smash it, and they're acquiring information about that object. And that's very important to motor development. So that's what I have for you for chapter 6. I hope you guys enjoy this chapter, and I will see you in the classroom. Have a good day.